All right, chapter 33. We're going to talk about the classical sonata. All right, remember, I know these are confusing, but we've already talked about the sonata allegro form, which is different than the genre sonata. So try to clarify that in your mind. Just like the Baroque concerto and the classical concerto are different, we've got different words. They're applied to the similar things, but very different. So try to really hone in on those differences. All right, so the sonata in the classical era was a very popular instrumental piece, a composition, but it was for just one or two instruments typically. Just like all these other instrumental pieces that we've heard, there are multiple movements. So, like the symphony had four movements, the concerto had three typically. The sonata would either have three or four, but the idea is that it was a multi movement cycle. The benefit of having just one or two instruments was that it was more intimate in its expression. Some of the most popular of all the classical sonatas are going to be by Mozart and Beethoven. They are the most significant in the genre. Both of them were very, very good at uh, keyboard instruments. This is an interesting picture that shows a young Beethoven performing for an older Mozart. And so you can see this would have been them coming in contact with each other. They lived at the same time and they knew each other for a little while at least. Beethoven wasn't born until 1770 versus 1756 when Mozart was born. The typical classical era sonata was typically performing in homes and for smaller audiences. So they would typically bring those concert works for, um, for these composer performers as showpieces. This was a chance for them to show off. Ludwig van Beethoven, if you think anything of him, perhaps you will know that he went deaf. He was a composer that went deaf, very tragically, but he managed to have a profound effect on music. All of music history has been affected by him since his beginning of writing music. He was born in Germany, and his father passed away by the age of 11. It was his job to support his mother and his brothers. And at age 22, he decided he was ready to move out and moved to Vienna, which was the music capital in Europe at that point. The piece you're going to listen to is dedicated to this lady, Countess Giulietta Guicciardi. So what he did was he worked under the modified patronage system, meaning he wasn't strictly only writing for one person, but he also worked for commission. He had public concerts, he published works, and he also taught aristocrats. But one of the most debilitating things was, of course, his progressive hearing loss that got worse and worse over time. Eventually, it kept him from being able to perform. He could still hear the music in his head, which is interesting. So he was still able to compose even after his profound hearing loss. Beethoven was an expert in large scale forms. He pushed everything to the limit. He brought new creativity to all of the genres, and he opened the way for the Romantic composers to begin questioning everything that had been so established with these classical era composers. He really put his individual sound into it and pushed against formal conventions and said, well, why do we have to do it this way? Let's do it a different way. And in so doing, really created very masterful pieces of work that were beyond his time period. Music historians typically divide his period into three different times. The first period of his writings were considered more reflective, very much in the style of the classical Haydn and Mozart. The second period was when he was getting a little angrier. He was starting to explore things. Strong dynamic contrasts, explosive accents and longer movements. Now you will, if you look at history and try to read a little bit more about his life, you'll see that there were some things kind of going on that triggered some of this change. And then the third period of his music was typically, the word transcendence is a good word because it's emphasizing kind of rising above all of the troubles that he had gone through. But you'll hear chromatic harmonies. So there's kind of questions, not so angry, but questions and possibilities presented in his third, um, the third section of his writings as music historians divide them into time periods. His output was 9 symphonies. Remember, Haydn had over 100. Beethoven had 9, and all of them are very well known. Several concertos, 32 piano sonatas, chamber music, 17 string quartets, and only 1 opera, which is actually a very popular one, and choral music as well. The piece you're going to listen to, I know you've heard before. It's called Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. This was written during his very classical time period, the first style period. The title was by a German poet, and it evoked the idea of moonlit scenery in Switzerland. It is also called a fantasy sonata. There are 3 movements in it. The first movement is going to be very dreamy. The second movement, a gentle scherzo in a major key. And the third movement, a stormy finale in sonata allegro form. This is all going to evoke the emotional expressiveness that comes in the Romantic era. What he said about it? Surely I have written better things. What we know it as? One of the most famous pieces of all times, and certainly a continued audience favorite. It was an immediate success. So take a listen to this, the Moonlight Sonata or Piano Sonata in C sharp minor. And you're going to be listening to that very expressive minor key, delicate melodies, continuous triplet patterns in the accompaniment, but the mood overall is very ethereal and soft. There's the listening guide for you to follow along with. If you choose to do that with this on the screen, that'll help you follow along.